Alright, hello everybody and welcome back to Plant Boy. My name is Cade and today we are going to be taking a look at watering tips. We are going to go over kind of like a watering 101 guide, everything on the surface level that you need to know about watering your houseplants. Before we get into this, I want to thank you for sticking around and supporting the channel. I really do appreciate it. And if you haven't subscribed already, please consider it if you enjoy the content, and let me know if you have any feedback or any topics you would like to see covered down in the comments below. So I have my notes over here and I was out gardening all day. It's been over 100 degrees, so I probably look hella greasy. Pay no mind to that, please. All right, everyone, and just note that there are going to be timestamps below in the description if you would like to skip around. So the first thing that you need to know is that overwatering kills the majority of houseplants. Oftentimes, new plant parents overwater their houseplants because they don't understand how dry the soil needs to get. And whenever you overwater a houseplant, it leads to anaerobic respiration within the soil, thus leading to root rot. And that is whenever your roots of your houseplants get brown and mushy and are no longer effective. And that can also promote things like fungus and bacterial growth as well that you really want to steer clear of. And it's important to note that not one size fits all in terms of watering your houseplants. Different houseplants require a different amount of water, so you definitely want to take your time researching the type of plant that you have and figuring out what type of watering conditions it prefers. So I have this broken down into three categories. We have thirsty plants, and these are going to be plants that you want to keep the soil moist but not wet. And whenever I say moist, I would definitely recommend getting a soil probe if I were you, and this kind of takes some of the guesswork out, but I would say the first ½ inch of soil starts to dry out, and then that's your indication. Examples of this would be Dieffenbachias, maybe things like ferns, a Boston fern, or peace lilies also prefer to stay a little bit moist. The next category is going to be not so thirsty houseplants. These are plants that you are going to want to let dry out in terms of the first inch or two of soil. If not, pretty far deep down into the soil, let it dry out. Don't let it get bone dry, as that may stunt the growth of the plant. But these are going to be, honestly, the large majority of houseplants that you have. Things like the Rhaphidophora tetrasperma or the Monstera adansonii, or really all of the plants around me, with the exception of a few, prefer to dry out at least the top 2 inches of soil or so, and then you're good to go in and water. The last category of houseplants that I have it broken down into in terms of watering are going to be drought-tolerant plants. These include things like your snake plants, your sansevierias, your cacti, and your aloe. Different plants like that that are usually native to an arid climate that don't get a whole lot of water very frequently. So these are plants that are not going to mind being relatively bone dry before you give them a healthy watering again. And this is where a soil probe is going to become really effective. Excuse how hacked up this sansevieria is. But if there's any moisture, this is a snake plant, left in the bottom of the pot, and I decide to water this again, snake plants are very intolerant to a lot of moisture sitting around their roots, so it's kind of difficult, especially if this were a larger pot, to assess all of the moisture throughout this pot. And that is why a soil probe would be very effective, because you can stick it down in there and get the moisture level at the very bottom of your pot. God, I'm a mess. Next, let's talk about what type of water you want to use. First and foremost, you can definitely use tap water on the large majority of your plants. Not many plants will really hate this. However, there are a lot of minerals, chemicals, and hard salts and things like that within your water that can do damage to the plant's foliage over a long period of time, and can actually linger around in the soil and do things like clog your drainage holes and things like that, which you obviously don't want. So ideally, you are going to be using either a filtered or a distilled water. Your best choice is going to be the use of a distilled water, and that has the least amount of trace chemicals, salt and minerals and things like that that can either build up in the foliage and damage the tips of leaves. Plants like Dracaenas are especially prone to brown tips due to either over-fertilization or a lot of minerals or things like that within the water that you are using to water the plant. Another plant that should almost only be strictly watered with distilled water ideally is going to be like a calathea or a prayer plant. These plants are very, very finicky about minerals and chemicals in the water, so just keep that in mind as well. So let's talk about how you can water your plants. Obviously you can, the most common method is just watering from the top, and that would just be putting a decent amount of water into here, let it drain through. Make sure that if you have a drainage tray underneath your plant, that you are not letting that plant sit in that water for more than several minutes to several hours. Doing so will definitely oversaturate the roots and lead to root rot over a period of time. So ideally, like this ZZ plant we can see here has a drip tray underneath it. Ideally, I would water this plant and then dump out this drip tray. The best way to water from the top that I have found is going to be taking your plants over to a sink or a place like that if you have like a utility sink, and let the water drain through into the drain. There's also a form of watering called sub-irrigation. So if I take this ZZ plant for example, this would be watering from the bottom of the plant. So if I were to fill up this drip tray with quite a bit of water, then obviously we are going to absorb water through the bottom of the pot and it will go up to the top. And this is really beneficial for the roots at the bottom of a very deep pot that can sometimes not get as much water as they need to whenever we are watering from the top. This is really the ideal way to do things, but it's really not going to make a huge difference if you are very thorough with your watering. There's also different ways of watering that include like those glass globes that you can place into your soil and let them drip over time. There are also stakes in which you have a vessel of water and like a wire or a rope, and then a stake that goes into the plant, and through capillary action the water is going to be absorbed from this vessel and put into the soil whenever the soil gets too dry. That's really ideal if you have a lot of houseplants and you cannot focus on watering them for a decent amount of time, or if you are going away and you're not going to be in your home for a few weeks to a few months, you can definitely use those stakes as well, and that should do just fine. So I would be remiss if I talked about watering and did not talk about drainage. So drainage is very, very important for your houseplants. I can definitely make a separate video on that, but ideally, just a rule of thumb, you want about 20 to 30% of the water that you are pouring into the top of your plant to come out of the bottom. You do not want things that drain too quickly with certain plants, as no moisture is being absorbed by the roots or the soil, and you are going to have to be watering very, very frequently. And you obviously do not want too dense of a soil mix, because then we are going back to that anaerobic respiration due to a lack of oxygen in the soil because the soil is too wet, which leads to root rot. So you can see that it's a balancing act. Most all-purpose things like Miracle-Gro and your other big box store brands are relatively okay to use as kind of a rule of thumb for many of your plants. You may just want to consider adding some sand, some perlite or vermiculite, all of which are going to increase the drainage, and it's better to have a little bit too quick of the drainage versus a lot of sopping moisture sticking around in a pot for far too long. So here are some tips and tricks that I have learned throughout my houseplant journey that I can share with you and hopefully give you some pointers that you may have not known. So ideally you want to water your plants whenever it is earlier in the day, ideally in the early morning hours. The reason for this is because the stomata, or the stoma of the plant or of the leaf or the foliage, is going to be open during the daylight hours, which allows respiration from the plant's leaves, which are going to aid in getting any excess moisture that may be in the soil out of the soil. The plant is going to uptake water much more readily, which is obviously going to be better to prevent root rot, prevent anaerobic respiration, and also to prevent fungal or bacterial problems due to soil being too moist. However, with that being said, it's not the end of the world if you water your plants towards the end of the day. Just try not to get in the habit of that unless you absolutely must. But in an ideal world, you would be watering in the early morning hours to allow respiration. Do your best to keep your foliage dry. If you are wiping down your foliage or spraying it down, that is one thing. Just try not to get in the habit of getting your foliage wet. And this kind of harps back to that sub-irrigation that we talked about from watering from the bottom. If you have a very foliage-rich plant, the snake plant might not be the best example, but if you have a very foliage-rich plant that is kind of hard to get down in here and water, sub-irrigation might be a good option because you really don't want a lot of moisture sitting on the foliage of your plant, as that can lead to fungus or rot or pest problems as well. So ideally, you want to keep your foliage dry and clean. Next, you want to make sure that you are aerating your soil every once in a while. It really depends. If you have really great drainage, if you have a lot of vermiculite or perlite or sand in your mix, it's much less likely to get compacted over a period of time, thus not allowing water to drain through it. If you've ever had a plant that has been very dry and you go and pour water onto the soil, and it just kind of beads up on top of the soil and it just chills there for a little bit, that's due to A, the soil being too dry, and B, not having enough aeration in the soil, which prevents the water from draining through it adequately. So what oftentimes happens is the water just runs down the sides of the planter and out of the bottom, and the roots in the center of your plant or the bottom center of your plant are not getting the water that they need. Furthermore, if you do have a plant that is very, very dry, I'm talking bone dry, like you could just lift it out of the pot because it is so dry and so kind of compacted in together, you definitely want to let that sit in some water. Ideally, take it over your sink, fill up your sink with a little bit of water, an inch or two of water, pour a little bit of water into the top of the plant so it doesn't float, and then let that water soak into the soil, and you will notice quite a substantial weight difference whenever you do so because there's so much more water into the soil. And like I said, oftentimes whenever a plant is way too dry, you are not going to get adequate drainage throughout the entirety of the soil mix, and that's going to lead to kind of an inadequate and inconsistent watering throughout the entirety of the soil. So if you have a plant that's very, very dry, let that soak and water it very deeply. All right, kind of a long one today, but I hope you all enjoyed it, and I hope that you learned something today, and let me know if you have anything else that you would like to see covered, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye-bye.